Welcome, everyone. I am really delighted to be here and to be able to sit here. I just wanted to open with one thing. There's been, I think, 3 moments in the last year or so when, in a review of my book, they said he's kind of in the shade of Susan Orlean, and I was like, yes! It was such a. It made me realize that there might still be hope yet at this, but I want to thank you all for coming, and congrats to you. You're just off the heels of winning the Literary Achievement Award at the Scripture Awards 2 nights ago, was it?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, it was really thrilling.
I just last night, when I was going through my questions, I saw one of the most awkward red carpet interviews with you at the thing where the guy clearly
had no idea.
He didn't seem to know what books were.
Right. I'm not sure he had ever read a book. And so I called upon my poise to cover up the fact that he had no idea what he was talking about.
Well, I'm setting that guy as my bar. I'm going to try to do a little bit better.
I think we can soar above it.
Well, first off, I just want to do a show of hands. How many have already read the book? Oh, right.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, good. Let's give it a round of applause. This is such a fascinating book. I mean, this is it's an arson investigation. It's an architectural study of the library. It's a social history of the city in flux. There's memoir running through it. For the small percentage that haven't read it, I think just to be fair to them, can you just give us a brief account of what happened on the morning of April 29th, 1986?
Sure. 1986, the LA Library was, and we're talking about the downtown branch, the main branch of the library. It was a tough time in the history of downtown LA, just to give you a little context. And the library was overfilled with books, had been quite neglected, but it was still a beloved building. At 10:09 a.m., a fire alarm was sounded, and nobody was particularly concerned because there were false alarms in the library all the time as evidence of some of this neglect. The fire system was not very reliable. In this case, though, unfortunately, it was a fire. It was not just a small fire, it was an inferno. When it got started, it exploded. It burned for 7.5 hours, and just about every single piece of fire equipment and firefighter in LA was called in to try to contain this fire. 7.5 hours of burning, finally it was put out. And when there was an assessment done of the damage, it was discovered that 400,000 books had been completely destroyed, and 700,000 were damaged. The library ended up being closed for almost 7 years from the point of the fire till it finally reopened. So it was determined within a day or two that it had been an arson, that it was a fire that was deliberately set.
And I want to get into that. First, though, I want to jump to the present, or at least 6 or 7 years ago. But could you walk us through how it was that you decided that this story would get the Susan Orlean treatment? I know there were sort of 2 main points of entry into this story with your son and your mom.
I had idly been thinking about libraries as an interesting thing to write about, but I felt that it was a little bit of a shapeless idea. I just had begun thinking, oh, libraries are so interesting, and I wonder what goes on in the day-to-day life of a library. we had then just moved to LA, and I had taken my son to our branch library. He had a school assignment to interview someone who worked for the city, and I had recommended that he interview a garbage man, and he recommended that he interview a librarian, which is evidence of what a good parent I am. And we were brand new to LA, looked up what was the nearest branch, and headed over. Something about that building triggered in me this flood, a tsunami of emotional memories of going to the library with my mom. And I used to go with her a couple times a week from the time, starting when I was probably even before I can remember. But I hadn't thought about those trips together for years and years, but it was so emotional. It was such a powerful memory of this almost magical ritual that involved getting in the car and driving to the library and each getting our books and what we would talk about on the way home. I was so moved that I couldn't help but think, what is it about libraries that are so profoundly emotional? I mean, if you think about it in a very purely sort of technical way, it's a building with books in it. But that's not the way we experience it. We experience them as these sacred kind of spaces that are filled with potential, with all of these stories. It moved me and made me think why I want to explore why these places are so deeply moving. I then was asked to give a talk to the Library Foundation board. This was, had nothing to do with anything. And at the end of the talk, the head of the Library Foundation said he wanted to give me a tour of the downtown library. I was very excited because I didn't know LA had a downtown. So we met there a few days later, and I fell in love with the building immediately because it's just, I grew up in Cleveland. Cleveland has a main branch of the library that's a very classic big city library, big sort of Parthenon-like building, big entrance, very grand. The LA library is so eccentric and such a fascinating building, so I immediately was in love with the building. As we were touring the building, we stopped in front of one of the stacks of books, and Ken Brecker, who was giving me the tour, pulled a book off the shelf and took a deep whiff of the book. And I thought, am I supposed to now, take the book from him and smell it? I didn't know what to do.
I
was new to LA. I thought this is an LA thing. So I kind of stood there awkwardly, and then he said, you can still smell the smoke in some of them. And I said, did they used to let people smoke in the library? And this was getting off to a good start, as you can tell. And he said, no, from the fire. And I said, from what fire? And he said, the big fire in 1986. And it clicked. So it was, a completely different story from the exploration of the emotional power of libraries, and yet it was related in the sense that the thought of a library burning is so horrible. I keep making the comparison that if it were City Hall, you would think, oh, that's too bad. There was a fire in City Hall. I don't think you would think, oh my God, how horrible. But I think for us, there is such a connection to books. There's such a sense that books are human and they contain something that's really truly connected to the human soul, that the thought of a library burning is uniquely disturbing. And that did relate to my original question, which was, why do libraries matter so much? Why do we feel so strongly about them? So the next thing, even though I had vowed not to write any more books, the next morning and when I heard it was an arson, I thought, like any journalist, oh, good.
Yeah.
But I just knew that I was being drawn by these multiple threads into this story about this place that was both very specific, namely the story of the LA Library, but also much bigger. And it was about our relationship to books, to stories.
And I don't know if you're comfortable mentioning it, but just also maybe giving me a sense of the context of what was going on with your mom at the time and why this was important to you.
It became deeply important to me in a way I couldn't have anticipated. As I said, I was reminded immediately of all of these trips to the library with my mother and how much she connected me to libraries. And she used to always say how much she wished she had been a librarian. That was her dream, that if her life had gone differently, she would have been a librarian. Soon after I began working on the book, my mom was diagnosed with dementia. And I became acutely aware of the way books preserve memory at a moment when my mother was losing her memory, and how that is one of the deeply sort of profound qualities of a library, is that it can remember forever. It can contain all of our stories forever. As I was watching my mother losing the story of who she was, the entire narrative of her identity. And unfortunately, she passed away before I finished the book. But I do feel that I did save the memory of those trips to the library with her in the book.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I mean, when you wrote about those memories being dislodged in that trip with your son, that the memories of going to the library with your son, with your mom, I mean, as you were reading it, it's as if they've been locked in some cupboard in my own mind. I was like, oh my God, yeah, they're all up there too. I have the same happy memories of going to our library with Mom, and I don't know why. I think one of my theories, which came from your book, but you had entered this phase where you were all about buying and owning books, right?
Right.
And so are you out of that now? Do you only go to libraries now as a result?
Well, it's funny because it really was a moment when I went to college, and my parents really believed in the library. I think their thought was, you don't need to have a book sit on a bookshelf. You need to read the book. And so these libraries exist, and you borrow the book, and then you give it back when you're done reading it, and you have what the whole point of the book, which was that you read it. And my parents grew up in the Depression. I'm sure there was a part of this that was about it's a silly thing to spend your money on books. So the minute I left home, the first thing I did was start buying books. And I would sometimes come home and I would ask my mother if she had read a particular book, and she'd say, no, but I'm only number 57 on the waiting list at the library. And I would think, just buy it. And I do think that, when you're making your first home for yourself, and buying things is part of the process of making your own home for the first time, it reminded me I mean, having a kid definitely reconnects you to the library.
For those who haven't read it or need a refresher, but can you introduce us to Harry Peake?
So Harry Peake was a young, very good-looking guy who grew up not that far from here, dreaming of being an actor. He moved to LA and did what all aspiring actors do, which is that he parked cars at the Sheraton and didn't pay his rent and somehow managed to scrape together the very beginnings of a living, did a lot of auditions, never got anywhere. Among other things, he discovered he had stage fright. But a little bit of an issue when you want to be an actor. But he was sort of nibbling along on the rind of Hollywood, fantasizing, dropping names. He was a boaster. He was a bit of a fibber. He was somebody that everybody liked. Everybody who I spoke to said, everyone loved Harry. He was a pain in the ass, and he would drive you crazy. But he was just charming and likable. He did have a propensity for telling stories that put him in the center of drama. So when the library fire occurred, he began telling people first that he had been there and had been rescued in this dramatic rescue, which was entirely patently false because nobody was rescued. Everybody evacuated the building they walked out of the building. But he was carried out of the building by a handsome fireman, and then the story evolved so that he began telling people that he had started the fire. Now, I learned a lot about crime in working on this book, and in fact, I feel that I learned how to be a better criminal. Because number one, I would say if you have started a $22 million arson fire in a municipal building, it's good not to tell people. Secondly, when this boasting about starting the fire eventually made its way to the arson investigators, Harry first said he had done it, and then changed his story and presented 7 different alibis. This was another primer in criminal behavior, which is it's good to have one alibi. Not so good to have 7 alibis. And the case ended up, it was a very complicated and convoluted case because, among other things, arson is an incredibly difficult crime to investigate. It's the least successfully prosecuted of all major crimes.
I think, did you say 1% are solved?
It's about 1%.
Okay.
And far fewer arsons are ever solved compared to murders, even.
You wrote that Harry's constant revisions made the truth about the day seem as unfixed as a drop of oil on water. And I remember, I don't remember, I saw you in an interview say, that you would stick to just one alibi, but it made me wonder, maybe having all of these shifting alibis was a brilliant strategy. Maybe that, because in the end, they just kind of threw their hands up and decided that this was an unreliable narrator, right?
I mean, in a sense, it made his confession just as sort of absurd and whifty as all of these other alibis. And the fact that he was so unreliable, I mean, he might have been, that might have been a brilliant strategy. My guess is it was he stumbled into it. I think that he was somebody who never, I mean, he was a dreamer. He was a fabulist. He even his sense of his own life was invented. I think the fact that he presented so many different alibis confounded the investigation for sure, because they each had to be chased down, and all but the final one were disproved. I mean, he said he had driven to his parents' house and made a bunch of phone calls while he was there. They just got phone records and proved that there were no phone calls made, that he never was at his parents' house. But his final alibi, which was that he was with two other men having lunch and having a wart on his foot treated, as one does. Best use of a wart as an alibi in the history of crime. And those two men were willing to provide sworn testimony that he was with them. So the fact is, without giving too much away, it was an incredibly vexing investigation, and there was no hard evidence. There was no fingerprint found. There was no source of ignition found. There was nothing physical at the fire that could be connected with anyone.
Was that vexing for you as well in your own investigation?
Well, it was, in the sense that when I first proposed this book to my publisher, he said, "I love it, and that's so cool, you'll probably solve the crime." And I said, "Yeah." As I was working on it, and on one hand, I found the fact that this is a book about stories, and that Harry was creating all of these stories, was sort of thematically consistent in the way, in a literary way. I thought, how interesting that he is just a storyteller. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, throughout the writing of the book, my husband kept saying to me, "Well, so doesn't it kind of ruin the book that you didn't find out who did it?" And I said, "Thank you for your support."
Yeah, I've been there.
And ultimately, I mean, I think it was about the story, and I didn't feel at the end frustrated as much as I feel suspended between these different possible explanations of what happened.
It struck me that, I mean, we go to libraries in search of facts. So much of the book is this sort of loving embrace of the pursuit of knowledge and all of the people that work to maintain and protect that knowledge. And so the fact beating at the heart of this was sort of a little unobtainable, right? I mean, this is whether or not he did it or whether or not it was even arson. I realized towards the end of the book, when you introduced the possibility that it might have just been some coffee pot that caught on fire, some wiring issue, I went back and started the book over again, because the whole time I was reading this as a cat and mouse, and that this was going to end with him behind bars, and my brain was so primed for that narrative. And then I realized that you were not definitively declaring along the way. In my brain, I was like, "Oh, Harry did it. We're going to get him. We're getting closer to him." But I was not, for whatever it's worth, I was not the least bit sort of deflated when he.
And that's actually, when my husband raised this concern, the fact is that I was aware of that, the idea that readers might be annoyed that there wasn't something definitive. On the other hand, it was very funny when I wrote The Orchid Thief. Supposedly the whole book was about trying to see a ghost orchid. And on my last trip into the swamp, as my deadline was looming and the time had passed, and I couldn't, this was my last chance, and I didn't see one. And one part of my brain thought, I'm in big trouble, like this book is ruined. And the other part of my brain felt completely comfortable with the idea that life is about pursuit, about yearning, about journey. It's not about some finite achievement. Mm-hmm. And in the case of The Orchid Thief, it was even more specifically about passion and about how passion is about the hunt and actually sometimes achieving what you're hunting for can be a disappointment. Mm-hmm. In the case of the library book, I went into it thinking I would concretely know what happened. But then I was comfortable, and particularly because of what happened to Harry, and there was something that was it was so much of the moment that he became ill, and the fact that we can't definitively know many things that we wish to know. What we do know is that this terrible fire occurred, that the city rose in response to it, and that the library healed itself. And the particulars fascinated me, and I was comfortable. I think a lot of people think that I must have secretly come to some conclusion mm-hmm. about what happened. And I did kind of have to contend with that.
It seems that in some regards, this book is sort of a love letter, or at least a reminder of how government or a taxpayer-funded institution can work for people and can provide a functional service that, not just beyond checking books out. You write. I didn't know that that the LA Public Library has been like blood draw zones, that were zones for people to do blood draws. That we know that they're a safe place for the homeless to get a foothold out of their situation. You have immigrants learning English there. You have kids earning their high school diplomas.
And I will say it is one. I think it's really true that libraries are one of the public institutions that people feel the most satisfied with. Mm-hmm. That they do what they say they're going to do, and they do it well.
This is not the DMV book.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I do think that's why even that library bond issues tend to succeed. Not always, but even the people who don't use the library regularly, I think, have the sense that libraries use their money wisely and effectively and are necessary. And there's never been, to my knowledge, any move to privatize libraries. I think people do feel they are meant to be public. They run the way they're supposed to run.
There are these just lovely details. One that jumps to mind is that the genealogy department is the epicenter of thefts in a library, that people become so absorbed in their deep family history that they forget to look after their laptop or their purses.
I know. I thought that was so. I shouldn't say it's funny.
It's kind of funny,
but it is very telling that people just get completely absorbed, and there's so much. The library is a phenomenal resource for genealogy, and there's even a librarian who's specifically assigned to assist people in doing genealogical research, but people kind of space out, and they're there reading, census records from Kansas from 1780 and forget and leave their laptop, and it gets...
And you write that in the religion section, the department head has to field complaints about people talking to God in overly loud voices. I'm wondering, this is an open question, but were there any details like these that revealed some new truth to you about human behavior that can really only be understood by observing them in a library? Was there something unique about this space that revealed something new to you?
Wow, that's a great question. I think I felt, well, I know this will sound funny, but I found the desire to learn, even though, of course, it's, we have to have that, but it renewed in me this faith in human curiosity. And part of that was just sitting at the checkout counter and seeing the books people were taking out. And of course, lots of them are fiction and people are reading them for entertainment. But I would look at each book that someone would be checking out and think, that's amazing that this person is curious about that thing. And I felt that even more when I sat in the reference room where people field phone calls. Hearing what someone somewhere in LA is wondering about at 10:51 a.m., that they are wanting to know who won the World Series in 1947, or just some random question. And it made me feel like people really do. It's like there is this giant synapse firing going on at all times. And I think you feel that in the library. You see it in the library, that people are constantly curious about something you never dreamed they were curious about.
I want to ask a couple questions on the writing process with this book, but I kept sort of gasping as one shiny, glimmering detail or character would appear and then make a departure from the narrative. When the other night I picked a chapter at random. You have someone overdosing on her husband's syphilis medication. You have a detail that every book on how to make liquor at home was checked out and never returned in the year leading up to Prohibition. You have a detail that LA's firemen had an unusual love of books about rabbits. You have people, this just kind of gutted me, but people that were hopefully scrawling messages for long-lost loved ones in the margins of books. You had a note about a well-known psychic who split his time between LA and the jungles of South America, where he maintained a herd of magical miniature horses.
I loved that.
I gasped, not just because of the joy that these details summon, but from an author's perspective, I kept wondering how the hell you finished this book. How challenging this must have been to write, that there were all these, you must have constantly been going into these cul-de-sacs of compelling characters and then deciding after several days of going down these rabbit holes that they didn't belong. And I'm wondering if this was a 6-year process?
Yeah, it was 6.5 years. And part of the reason is exactly as you note, that there were so many, I mean, this is story upon story upon story, and there was almost nothing that didn't tempt me to go further. I mean, for instance, Gene Scott. Mm-hmm. So Gene Scott was one of the early televangelists, and he ran the Church of the Open Door in downtown LA, and he got very involved in the fundraising effort after the library burned. The insurance that the city had was for the building, but not for the books. The building actually was in pretty good shape. It was the books that were the great loss. So the money to replace those books had to be raised. There was no line item, obviously, in the city budget. Anyway, so Gene Scott got very involved in helping raise money. So you would think this would be a 2-minute sort of research on Gene Scott. Well, Gene Scott turns into being this unbelievably strange, charismatic weirdo who would, he was on 24 hours a day on a cable channel. He had a huge following. He would ride around in his Rolls-Royce convertible with girls dancing behind him and record. He would say things into the camera like, if you don't send in money, I hope you throw up upside down.
Oh.
And, he was just an unbelievable loony. Also brilliant. He had a PhD from Stanford in divinity. And, he was just this incredible character. The story went on and on and on. And there's a point where I had to sort of pull up the reins and say, okay, hang on. I mean, I'm now writing about televangelists and, going down this rabbit hole. How do I bring it back to the book? And this happened over and over and over again. And it was delicious, but being a nonfiction writer, in a sense, is being a curator. I mean, you need to curate which facts and which stories are going to serve the single purpose of the book. So similarly, the stories of, I thought I would write a paragraph or two about the former city librarians. Mm-hmm. And, that it would just be almost a list of who had run the library. Well, then I started doing some research into it, and each of their stories were so phenomenal, so fascinating. There was a point when I thought maybe I should just do a book about Charles Lummis, because his story was so fascinating. So it involved, I feel like it's important for me to do all that, and know all of it. The mistake would be to put it all on the page, where it becomes the sort of art of curating and figuring out how much time you can go down one particular rabbit hole without losing the reader. You never want the reader to go, wait, why am I reading about a televangelist when this is a book about the library? You want people to never lose track of how this story eventually will come back and enrich your understanding of the main story. But it's why it took me so long, because I do feel that it's important that I knew all of that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering were there any really tough knockdown dragouts with your editor where he had to, or she had to convince you?
Luckily not, because I edit myself pretty harshly.
Okay.
And there were, I feel like one strength of mine is this sense of I've gone far enough down this path. I need to come back. And I left out lots of amazing stories because I just felt that's too much. It's too far afield, and I need to circle back to the main branch of the story.
You closed the book with this beautiful declaration that even the oddest, most particular book was written with that kind of crazy courage, the writer's belief that someone would find his or her book important to read. I was struck by how precious and foolish and brave that belief is, and how necessary and how full of hope it is to collect these books and manuscripts and preserve them. I had this feeling that the book, maybe the process of writing this book and figuring out this story, maybe did it reinvigorate a sense of your sort of optimistic streak in a darker time? Am I projecting here? I mean, I'm Swedish, so I'm pretty dour about most things, but this feels like an incredibly optimistic declaration, and I'm wondering.
It absolutely. it was it was also a message to myself to some degree, saying, you know what, I worked 6.5 years, and it's worth it. This is what we do. We tell stories, and I feel fortunate to be one of those people who's telling stories, and that libraries are optimistic, that simply saying the stories we tell should be preserved for eternity is a way of believing in the value of human communication, and a belief in this idea that these documents should be shared and saved. So it absolutely was optimistic. And frankly, there would be times where I'd see someone at the checkout counter with a really weird book, and I would look at the book and think, I cannot believe someone wrote that book. And then I would look at the person and think, I can't believe someone would read this book. And then I think, they found each other.
Yeah.
It's like two really ugly people meeting and falling in love. And
not to be judgmental or anything,
but I mean, in a way, I found it so wonderful to think that this is amazing, that we really do have something to tell each other and share with each other. And it certainly was deeply optimistic, and also a kind of message to myself about the work, the effort to tell stories is meaningful and important.
And are you now hopefully permanently disabused of the idea that you may stop writing books? I mean, I saw you just tweeted this week that you're working on your next book.
Yes, and actually, weirdly, I mean, it's funny because I was so determined not to write another book. I just felt like it's too much work. Takes too much time. I'm slow. I don't need to write another book. This did make me. It renewed my feeling of, I mean, I love writing for magazines. There's an impermanence to that, that writing a book counterbalances in a way that makes it feel important. So I decided, all right, I'm going to write another book, and then weirdly, so I just began work on this other book, and then someone came to me with a great idea. So I thought, am I actually writing 2 books?
Oh,
I mean, when I was going to write 0 books,
and
now I'm. I might have to do it because it's a great story, and it kind of fell into my lap. So I might end up working on 2 books. Like, what a nightmare.
I am left to wonder. Well, 2 things. What if you had taken your son's advice and gone and interviewed a garbage man? Who knows what would have...
Well, I am sure there's a great story to tell about a garbage man.
I am. My grandpa was a garbage man, so watch your laughing. The only other thing I'm curious about, and I know we talked about being content with not getting to a definitive answer, but since the book has come out, has any new information trickled into your inbox, or?
No, well, I got repeatedly emails from someone who had anonymized his or her email address saying, I know who started the fire, and if you want to know, get in touch with me. And it was tempting, but at the same time, I found it a little concerning, just to respond to an email address that had been made purposefully obscured. So I hesitated, then I got another one, and it was sort of belligerent, with all capital letters, and I thought, I don't know, if I really had information, would I be it made me uncomfortable. So I didn't respond, and it may be that I'll miss out on the great sort of reveal, but
I don't think we need it. Our clock has run out, but this is such an immense honor to be able to sit up here with you.
well,
and
thank
so
you.
thank you for writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you all.